Welcome to the Utkal Success Academy video series. Today, we delve into the historical underpinnings of the Indian Constitution. The constitutional history is marked by key acts under two major phases: the Company Rule from 1773 to 1858, and the Crown Rule from 1858 to 1947. These foundational acts were instrumental in shaping the Indian Constitution. The Regulating Act of 1773 laid the foundation for British parliamentary control. Key provisions included designating the Governor-General of Bengal, creating an executive council, and establishing a Supreme Court in Calcutta. The act initiated centralization and parliamentary control over the East India Company. Now a practice question on the Regulating Act of 1773. The question asks which statements are correct: Governor-General designation, subordination of Bombay and Madras, and establishment of a Supreme Court. The correct answer is D. All statements are correct, as the act was the first step toward British parliamentary control. The second question tests which provisions were introduced by the 1773 Act. Statements 1, 2, and 4 are correct, making option A the right answer. Dual government was introduced earlier, in 1765, by Robert Clive, not by this act. Question 3 explores the political and administrative shifts. Statements 1 and 3 are correct, indicating the political role of the company and Crown supervision, which corresponds to option A. Statement 2 is incorrect, as judiciary-executive conflict existed. The fourth question addresses the conflict between the Supreme Court and the Governor-General in Council. The conflict arose mainly due to the absence of clear jurisdictional boundaries. This confusion necessitated the Act of Settlement of 1781. For exam purposes, remember the core pillars of the 1773 Act: the beginning of central administration, parliamentary control, the first Governor-General, centralization of power, and the establishment of the Supreme Court. Always link this act to the start of the Company Rule and formal British oversight. Next, Pitt's India Act of 1784 established dual control, strategically separating trade and politics. It created the Court of Directors for trade and the Board of Control for political matters, thereby establishing British political supremacy. The first question on Pitt's India Act of 1784 asks about dual control, the Board of Control, and the end of commercial functions. Statements 1 and 2 are correct, as the commercial role continued. The correct option is A. Question 2 assesses changes brought by the 1784 Act. Statements 1, 2, and 3 are correct, including the reduction of the council members and the political commercial separation. Statement 4 is incorrect, as the Supreme Court was established earlier. Option A is correct. Question 3 asks about Crown authority and centralized control. Statements 1 and 3 are correct. Statement 2 is incorrect, as the Governor-General was still bound by council decisions. Thus, option A is the correct answer. The Charter Act of 1813 ended the East India Company's trade monopoly, with exceptions for tea trade and trade with China. Trade with India was then open to all British subjects. Remember keywords like dual control and Board of Control for the 1784 Act. Question 1 on the Charter Act of 1813. Statements 1 and 2 are correct. The monopoly ended partially, and missionaries were allowed. Statement 3 about open competition is incorrect, as it came in the 1853 Act. The correct option is A. The final question on the 1813 Act. Statements 1, 2, and 4 are correct, including the grant for education and Crown sovereignty. Statement 3 is incorrect, as trade was not completely abolished. Option A is the correct answer.
The Charter Act of 1833 was a key milestone, marking the centralization of governance. The Governor-General of Bengal became the Governor-General of all India, first held by Lord William Bentinck. It centralized lawmaking and ended the East India Company's commercial era, making it an administrative body.
Our first practice question on the Charter Act of 1833 asks about the Governor-General, the end of commercial activities, and open competition. Statements 1 and 2 are correct. Statement 3 about open competition is incorrect, as it was fully established in the 1853 Act. The correct answer is A. Question 2 assesses key provisions of the 1833 Act. Statements 1, 2, and 4 are correct, covering centralized legislative powers, the law member, and the extension of legislative power. Statement 3, regarding the abolition of slavery, is incorrect, as it happened later in 1843. Option A is the correct answer.
Question 3 focuses on the non-discrimination clause and centralization. Statements 1 and 3 are correct, pertaining to the equality clause and the start of a central legislature. Statement 2 is incorrect. Legislative powers of Bombay and Madras were taken away, not restored. The correct option is A. For final revision on the 1833 Act, remember it was the peak of centralization. Key points include the Governor-General of India designation, the end of the company's commercial role, the addition of the first law member, and the introduction of the non-discrimination clause. Moving to the Charter Act of 1853. This act introduced separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches of the Governor-General's Council. It also established open competition for the Indian civil services, ending the company's nomination system. Question 1 on the 1853 Act. The Act introduced open competition and separated legislative and executive functions. However, the company rule ended in 1858, not 1853. Thus, statements 1 and 2 are correct, making option A the answer. Question 2 addresses features of the 1853 Act. Statements 1 and 2 are correct, additional members for legislative purposes and a separate legislative council. Statement 3 is incorrect as the renewal period was indefinite. Statement 4 is incorrect as Indian representation began in 1861. The correct option is A. Question 3 covers the merit-based civil services and the Act being the last Charter Act. Both statements 1 and 2 are correct. Statement 3 about the parliamentary system is incorrect. The correct answer is A. Key memory points for the 1853 Act. It was the last Charter Act, introduced open competition for civil services, established legislative separation, and was renewed for an indefinite period, indicating an impending takeover by the Crown. The Government of India Act of 1858, also known as the Act for the Good Government of India, transferred control from the East India Company to the British Crown following the 1857 revolt. It created the office of the Secretary of State for India and designated the Governor-General as the Viceroy. Question 1 on the 1858 Act. Statements 1 and 2 are correct. Administration transferred to the Crown and the Secretary of State office was created. Statement 3 is incorrect as open competition was from the 1853 Act. The correct answer is A. Question 2. The Act abolished the dual government, created the Council of India, and transformed the Governor-General into the Viceroy. Responsible government was not established yet. Thus, statements 1, 2, and 4 are correct, making option A the answer. Question 3. The Act was a direct response to the revolt of 1857 and centralized Indian administration under the British Parliament. Bicameralism was not introduced. Statements 1 and 2 are correct, leading to option A. Final memory points for the 1858 Act. It marked the end of company rule, established the Secretary of State, assisted by the Council of India, changed the GG to Viceroy, and abolished the dual control system. We now transition to the Indian Councils Act of 1861, a crucial measure after the 1857 revolt. This act introduced Indians into the lawmaking process for the first time, albeit as nominated non-official members. Key features of the 1861 Act include the first-time legislative inclusion of Indians, recognition of the portfolio system introduced by Lord Canning, and the restoration of legislative powers to the Bombay and Madras presidencies, initiating decentralization. Question 1 on the 1861 Act. Statements 1 and 2 are correct concerning legislative decentralization and the Viceroy's power to nominate Indians. Statement 3 is incorrect, as open competition for civil services began in the 1853 Act. The correct option is A. Question 2 asks about provisions introduced by the 1861 Act. The portfolio system, expanded executive council for legislative roles, and the Viceroy's ordinance power were all provisions of this act.
Bicameralism was introduced much later, in 1919. Thus, the correct answer is A. To summarize the 1861 Act, it restored legislative powers to provinces, introduced the portfolio system, and gave the viceroy the power to issue ordinances in emergencies. It also marked the minimal Indian involvement in governance through nomination. Next, the Indian Councils Act of 1892 increased the size of the legislative councils and introduced the principle of indirect elections. This provided a limited but significant representative element to the councils for the first time. The 1892 Act also introduced new legislative powers. Members could discuss the annual budget and address questions to the executive, although they were not permitted to vote on the budget. Question 1 on the 1892 Act. Statements 1 and 3 are correct, covering the increase in non-official members and the right to discuss the budget. Direct elections, Statement 2, were not introduced in this Act, making A the correct answer. Question 2 examines the core provisions of the 1892 Act. It introduced the indirect system of representation and the right to ask questions. However, members could not vote on the budget, and the official majority was maintained. Option A is correct. The final memory points for the 1892 Act. It introduced indirect elections and the right to discuss the budget and ask questions, marking a limited increase in Indian political engagement. Moving on to the Indian Councils Act of 1909, known as the Morley-Minto Reforms. This act significantly expanded the legislative councils and introduced direct elections for the first time, albeit with restrictions. The 1909 Act tragically introduced the system of communal electorates for Muslims, permanently institutionalizing the separation based on religion. It also appointed Satyendra Prasad Sinha as the first Indian member of the Viceroy's Executive Council. Question 1 on the 1909 Act. Statements 1 and 2 are correct regarding separate electorates and Indian appointments to the Executive Council. Statement 3 is incorrect, as responsible government was not established at the center. The correct option is A. Question 2 checks the provisions of the 1909 Act. Enlargement of councils, direct elections, and communal representation were introduced. However, members could discuss the budget but had very limited voting power. Option A is correct. Question 3 focuses on the structure. Statements 1 and 2 are correct. The number of non-official members increased, but the official majority was retained at the central level. Statement 3 is incorrect. The correct option is A. The Indian Councils Act, 1909, also known as the Morley-Minto Reforms, introduced separate electorates for Muslims and expanded legislative councils at the center and provinces. It allowed limited direct elections, included Indians in the Executive Council, and increased participation in governance, though real power remained with the British authorities. The Government of India Act, 1919, also known as the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms, introduced major constitutional changes in British India. It divided subjects between the center and provinces and introduced diarchy in provinces by separating reserved and transferred subjects. It also established a bicameral legislature at the center, increased Indian representation in administration, and expanded limited voting rights. The correct answer is 1 and 3 only. The Government of India Act 1919 introduced diarchy in the provinces and devolved legislative powers to provinces. Separate communal electorates for Muslims had already been introduced earlier under the Morley-Minto Reforms of 1909. Now, a detailed explanation of the Government of India Act 1919, also known as the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms. Key structural changes included diarchy, a dual government system in provinces, and devolution, which separated central and provincial subjects. Let's review a UPSC 2015 question. The Government of India Act of 1919 clearly defined the jurisdiction of the central and provincial governments. Other options, like the formal separation of the judiciary and legislature, or powers of the Secretary of State, were not clearly defined by this act. A UPSC 2016 question asks about the Montagu-Chelmsford proposals. They were related to constitutional reforms. Key features included diarchy in provinces, bicameralism at the center, and the introduction of direct elections, or franchise. Options A, B, and C are incorrect.
because the 1919 proposals focused strictly on the political and administrative framework. They did not primarily address social reforms, educational reforms, or police administration reforms. For UPSC 2017, we examine diarchy. It refers to the division of subjects delegated to the provinces into two categories: reserved subjects controlled by the governor, and transferred subjects managed by Indian ministers responsible to the legislatures.
The diarchical system of government was introduced by the Government of India Act 1919. This act was the first attempt to introduce a partially responsible government in the provinces.
The Government of India Act 1919 also introduced a bicameral legislature at the central level for the first time. This central legislature was divided into the Council of State and the Legislative Assembly. Now, let's turn to the Government of India Act 1935. It planned for an all-India federation that never materialized. It divided powers into federal, provincial, and concurrent lists. Diarchy was abolished in provinces, but introduced at the center. Key features borrowed from the 1935 Act for the Constitution of India include the federal scheme, the office of the governor, the federal court structure, public service commissions, the three-list system for power division, and emergency provisions. A UPSC 2018 question on the Act of 1935 asks about residuary powers. These powers were given to the Governor General, reflecting the centralized nature of British authority. Which act aimed at providing a federal structure for India? It was the Government of India Act 1935, which proposed the All India Federation, laying the groundwork for the modern federal structure. Statements 1 and 2 regarding the 1935 Act are correct. It introduced provincial autonomy and provided for the All India Federation. However, Statement 3 is incorrect, as the Act introduced diarchy, not responsible government, at the center. Key features of the 1935 Act included the establishment of a federal court, bicameralism in certain provinces, and the extension of separate electorates. The introduction of diarchy in provinces is incorrect, as it was abolished. To summarize the 1935 Act, it brought provincial autonomy, abolished diarchy in provinces, proposed an all-India federation, and established the federal court and bicameral provinces. Finally, the Indian Independence Act of 1947 declared India independent and sovereign. It ended British rule, made the viceroy and governors constitutional heads, established responsible government, and granted the Constituent Assembly full powers. Q1 focuses on the Indian Independence Act 1947. All three statements are correct. It partitioned British India into two dominions, abolished the office of the Secretary of State for India, and granted complete sovereignty to the constituent assemblies. Q2 asks about other provisions of the 1947 Act. Statements 1, 2, and 3 are correct. The Act ended British suzerainty over princely states, allowed dominions to frame their own constitutions, and kept the Governor-General as the Crown's representative. The federal structure was proposed earlier in 1935. Key memory points from 1947 include the partition of India and Pakistan, the end of British rule and sovereignty over princely states, the constituent assemblies gaining full sovereignty, and the abolition of the Secretary of State for India office. Thank you for joining this video by Utkal Success Academy. We hope this review of constitutional development was helpful for your preparation.